are, and what I'm going to do now is just provide a bit of context to effectively the sort of police procedure and the background to it. So as Vanessa says, the arrest was made under Section 12 of the Terrorism Act 2000, and that's support of a prescribed organisation. So the person commits the offence if they invite support for a prescribed organisation, and that is not restricted to money. Obviously, a definition that is open to quite considerable interpretation. There was an amendment made in 2019 with the Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Act, and that is written up here, which is that you also commit an offence if you express an opinion or belief that is supportive of the prescribed organisation, and in doing so, whether you're reckless as to whether a person to whom the expression is directed will be encouraged to support a prescribed organisation. Now, we really are into the area of thought crime here, because it looks very much like if you're in any way criticising the government narrative or the actions of the Israeli state, that is putting you in a de facto position of supporting Hamas as a prescribed organisation. That's the way that this has been inverted, which of course is completely beside the specific point of having prescribed organisations. Now, the Home Office guidance has been changed this year. You might remember a report on the rather ludicrous prescription of a completely ill-defined organisation called Terrogram. But the point is that in writing up prescribed organisations, you are able to capture people with a very wide net. So what are such things? Well, the Home Secretary may prescribe if they believe that the organisation is concerned in terrorism and, critically, that it is proportionate to do so. So what determines whether or not prescription is proportionate? Well, there are a number of criteria that may be satisfied. It's not a suggestion that they all need to be, but it is worth pointing out with regard to Hamas particularly that it says the specific threat that it poses to the UK. Well, at the moment, that's not defined, or at least not substantiated. The specific threat that it poses to British nationals overseas, the extent of the organisation's presence in the UK, and the need to support other members of the international community. Well, which other members, I think, is a question that must be asked at that point. Also, the other thing that I've mentioned many times before is that Hamas was only prescribed by the Home Secretary in this country in November 2021. So in effect, what Sarah Wilkinson has been put through would not have been possible had this happened 3 years ago. I think that's a point worth bearing in mind. Now we'll look at the use of effectively anti-terror powers, and these are from the statistics produced just last week, within which they state that there were 212 arrests for terrorist-related activity. This is only finishing 31st of March this year, so it'll be very interesting to see by what factor that's gone up in the succeeding time. That's an overall rise of 8%. But I think the significant detail here is that 68%, in other words, only 32% resulted in a charge. Of course, they don't go on to say how many of those charges resulted in a conviction, or indeed how many actually got to court. Now, the other point to draw out here, which again we've talked about a lot before, is concerning magistrates. The warrant for the entry to the property and the seizure of all of Sarah Wilkinson's devices was granted by a magistrate. How do you become a magistrate? Well, you do not need formal qualifications or legal training to become a magistrate. You'll get full training for the role, and a legal advisor in court will help you with questions about the law. Okay, so how full is that training? In your first year, training to be a magistrate will take 3 to 5 days. I mean, were the situation not so dire, this would almost be laughable. But sadly, this is the system which is very, very intentionally put in place in order that it may be subverted, in order that this outcome may specifically be engineered by police putting pressure on a magistrate in order to obtain such a warrant. They will roll over due to insufficient training, insufficient understanding of the situation, and a complete inability to look at things in a reasonable, proportional, and necessary manner. The other thing to look at, of course, is the bail. Now, there are 3 reasons for granting pre-charge bail by police, and there is no doubt at all that the bail conditions imposed upon Sarah Wilkinson are oppressive in the extreme. This seems to be the clause which best fits the situation now, in that then it's no longer necessary to detain her in order to secure or preserve evidence, because either that has been done by speaking to her or from gathering the objects of the search, which was conducted in such a vindictive manner in her house. but they're not in a position to charge, so the suspect must be released, and they have absolutely done so with malice at the front of their minds, stating that further investigation, that she's gone on bail where there is a need for further investigation of any matter for which they were detained. Well, it's very hard to argue what exactly that might be. So I'll just round off this segment by asking the question, who are the terrorists? This is from the Terrorism Act 2000, and Section 1 starts by defining it, where the threat of action, the use or threat of action, is designed to intimidate the public or a section of the public, and the use or threat is made for the purposes of advancing a political, religious or ideological cause. Well, that is ever more increasingly matching the behaviour of the UK state with regard to these people who are putting themselves in such a place as to be critical of the regime. So that sort of wraps up this segment. No doubt we'll talk about this a lot more in Extra. Now we're going to go to Ukraine, where Zelensky seems to be under a certain amount of pressure, and Mike's going to deal with that for us.
Well, indeed.